Chapter 5. The Fallacy of the Great Idea. Between the idea and the reality, between the motion and the act, falls the shadow. T.S. Eliot from The Hollow Men. I've just had this great idea. The novelist and poet Vladimir Nabokov may have been coming it a bit high when he told an interviewer in the mid-1960s that great ideas are hogwash and that style and structure are the essence of a book. In the real world, at least, ideas are not hogwash, but they are very unlikely to make you rich on their own. More importantly, it really does not matter who gives birth to any particular idea. This is borne out by the laws relating to patents and inventions. You cannot patent an idea. You can only patent your own method for implementing an idea. It is for this reason that so many people have become rich despite never having had a single great idea in their lives. As it happens, I count myself among them. It is good to have a goal. True believers in a great idea are often obsessed with achieving a particular goal. Such an obsession, properly harnessed, can produce wealth. Sadly, that wealth rarely finds its way into the pockets of the person whose obsession created it. As far as this book is concerned, their goal was flawed, even though their aim was true. Take a small example. Decades ago, my old friend Tony Elliott was determined to force British television and broadcasting companies to permit him to publish their forthcoming programme schedules in his London weekly magazine, Time Out. The BBC and ITV, among others, were aghast. They were making a fortune by licensing their schedules for the week ahead exclusively to Radio Times and TV Times. Tony's great idea was simple. He wanted to break that cosy monopoly and force the broadcasters to release their schedules to any publisher who requested them. Alongside Time Out's reviews and listings of movies, plays, concerts, restaurants and all the rest, he planned to include a comprehensive television viewing guide. This was certainly a laudable goal and not a bad idea. But the goal in and of itself could only produce so many extra readers. In addition, should he succeed, this would mean that a great many other publishers would obtain access to these television schedules and publish them in their own magazines. Many of these publishers were rivals, at least on the newsstand, to Time Out. In addition, taking on the television broadcasters in a long drawn-out legal battle was likely to be an expensive undertaking. To sum up, was the light worth the candle? Tony thought so. He sought allies and found them. He spent real money in legal fees on his campaign. He became obsessed with this goal for a while, or at least it seemed that way to me, ignoring even his own staff's concerns that there might be more important battles to fight and more pressing issues to address. Eventually, after a long and gruelling battle, Tony won a victory, but only a victory of sorts. Television broadcasting schedules, to a degree, moved into the public domain. Many magazines could now publish them. And what happened? I expect Time Out sales went up briefly when its fully fledged television listings appeared, but I would bet considerable money they did not go up anything like enough to repay the legal costs and the lost management time Tony must have incurred. Worse still, it was mostly other magazine publishers in Britain who reaped the real harvest and continue to do so. Today, UK retail shelves are groaning with magazines that carry television listings. Tony's great idea was a great idea, but it proved to be an even better idea for other publishers. Fortunately, Time Out has since gained a large UK subscriber base and has stabilised newsstand sales in Britain. Better still, it has established several foreign editions, most notably in New York City, which have done vastly more to improve Tony's fortunes than his noble battle with the emperors of television all those years ago. Having a great idea is simply not enough. The eventual goal is vastly more important than any idea. It is how ideas are implemented that counts in the long run. Good ideas are like Nike sports shoes. They may facilitate an athlete who possesses them, but on their own they are nothing but an overpriced pair of plimsolls. Specially adapted plimsolls may be a good idea, but the goal is still to win, and sports shoes don't win. Athletes do. And yet I have lost count of the number of men and women who have approached me with their great idea, as if this, in and of itself, was some passport to instant wealth. The idea is not a passport. At most, it is the means of obtaining one. Ray Kroc of McDonald's fame did not invent the idea of fast food. Humans have been stuffing their face on the run since the dawn of history. His genius was merely to recognize this fact and implement a simple 5-point plan. Standardize the food and prices, franchise the outlets, produce the food swiftly in clean surroundings, offer value for money, and market the whole shebang relentlessly. Easy to state, hard to implement. And it flew in the face of all conventional wisdom concerning the sale of fast food at the time. But it was the implementation of this plan that turned a 52-year-old milkshake mixer salesman with diabetes and asthma into a billionaire. Every element of his plan had been discovered years before. There were thousands of fast food outlets in the USA at the time, including a few owned by the McDonald brothers, from whom he purchased his own outlets. Yet it was Kroc's McDonald's that emerged as the ultimate market leader, not just because of a great idea, but through unremitting sweat and adherence to core principles. Personally, I despise fast food and would consume it only when there is no alternative, but Ray Kroc's story remains a testimony to the ability of an entrepreneur to change the face of an industry and make himself very rich in the process. There is another side to the subject of ideas in commerce: stealing them, or to put it more pleasantly, emulating them. The error of failure to emulate a winning idea pervades every industry at all levels. Mainly this is due either to indolence or to folly. Of indolence, no more need be said. The folly, on the other hand, often takes the shape of a peculiar affliction, known colloquially as the "it wasn't invented here" syndrome. I would place this affliction very high on the list of reasons preventing individuals and companies from achieving major success. Why people should be loath to emulate success is a matter for psychologists. The fact that they do is a matter of fact. The result of such ostrich-like behaviour can be catastrophic, as I discovered to my cost. Dennis Publishing had been involved in magazines featuring computer and electronic games from their beginnings in the 1980s. We had competitors, of course, but we were certainly a big part of the UK market. What we didn't know was that we were about to take a massive pasting from a smallish rival. Enter Chris Anderson, who founded Future Publishing. Chris had two great ideas which he executed perfectly. Firstly, he was prepared to pay the likes of Sony a king's ransom to secure the publishing rights to magazines such as the official Sony PlayStation magazine. Secondly, he put his magazines in a bag and also popped into the bag a playable electronic game. All this meant that Future's magazines were more expensive to produce than the competitors, and more expensive on the newsstand. It also meant that Future Publishing did not own such magazines themselves. The intellectual property rights were licensed from the hardware manufacturers. In the end, the official Sony PlayStation magazine did not belong to Chris. He was just the publisher. The thought of publishing a magazine I did not own was off-putting to me. Nor was I that keen on handing over millions of dollars in advance to huge companies like Sony or Sega. Thus, Dennis Publishing stuck to producing unofficial magazines in the games market. Sounds smart, right? Our costs were less, although we were forced to scrabble around constantly attempting to locate second-rate games to include in our bagged issues. Future's games were top of the line because they were official. By now, most readers had come to expect a free game with every Electronic Games magazine they bought. The result was predictable. Future Publishing wiped the floor with Dennis Publishing in the computer and Electronic Games magazine market. Readers didn't care about the magazine. They cared about the free game in the bag. Manufacturers of games were reluctant to allow us to buy their games to put in our bags because we published only unofficial titles. In essence, the market was a monopoly, and Dennis Publishing had backed the pirates and lost. In the end, we sold those few Dennis Publishing Games magazines that we'd not already folded to Future at fire sale prices. Well, maybe not fire sale prices, but nothing like as much as I would have wished to receive. They'd pasted us, and we deserved to be pasted. And yet this process took years. Year after year we plugged away attempting the impossible. We invested heavily on the internet and produced a successful games portal, which we also sold to Future. The Dennis Internet Games portal was more successful than our magazines. Why? For the simple reason that we were not fighting with one hand tied behind our back, as we were on the newsstands with the official versus non-official branding. On the internet at least, we were not perceived as pirates. It wasn't that Dennis wouldn't fight, or that we lost heart, but we were not prepared to emulate Future and invest the money to acquire official licenses ourselves. Even when we did try with a later games platform, Microsoft's Xbox, our rivals were smart enough to pay way above the odds to shut us out of the market. Future's template was there. Their success was obvious. Dennis had the financial resources, or could have borrowed them at a pinch, but we hated to admit that we were wrong, and by the time we'd come to grips with our idiocy, Future had signed up virtually all the official games magazine publishing rights that mattered. Even today I shudder at the thought of the wasted blood, sweat and treasure we expended on our games magazines. Dennis Publishing failed in the electronic games market because we would not, and later could not, emulate a winning idea. My managers argued, both at the time and in hindsight, that the licenses themselves were immensely difficult to obtain and that Sony's dominance precluded success once Future had obtained it. All this may be true, but why then did we continue battling what amounted to a monopoly for so long in the same old way? The answer is that we found it repugnant to admit that Future had hit upon the right idea and that we had refused to emulate it. What I should have done was take my best men and women in the company and send them to Japan, Europe or America, or anywhere where Sega, Sony and Microsoft and the rest would agree to meet with us. We should have wined, dined and cozied up to them. We should have searched for another vehicle via which the popularity of such games could be exploited. If no other vehicle could be found, we should have tried trumping Future's offers worldwide. Cash is a great persuader. If this wouldn't fly, we should have exited the market. We did none of these things in any meaningful way, and we paid the price. We were pasted because we refused to emulate. On a less painful note, let's take a look at what happens when you are prepared to emulate an idea and execute it brilliantly. In May 1994, Britain's largest magazine publishing company, IPC, launched a magazine for young men called Loaded. This was the brainchild of its editor, James Brown. How Brown had persuaded the suits at IPC to permit this stroke of genius remains a mystery, although I can personally testify to James' powers of charm and persuasion in a clinch. Loaded was the first of the so-called lads' magazines, and its success created a new genre, simultaneously threatening old guard titles like Esquire and GQ while racking up colossal newsstand sales. Loaded was a breath of fresh air in the men's magazines market. Irreverent, funny, subversive and addictive, James' timing was impeccable. This was the ink-on-paper version of the BBC sitcom Men Behaving Badly, or the sports quiz, They Think It's All Over. Every other consumer magazine publisher in England was consumed with envy. IPC's deadly rival, EMAP, immediately set about revamping a tiny men's fashion title they'd acquired called FHM, For Him Monthly, possibly the worst-named magazine in history. But names don't count, as pop groups like the Rolling Stones or the Beatles demonstrate. FHM became a copy of Loaded, with a twist of its own. It avoided madcap elements, for which the latter was infamous, and had a slightly sexier, more sophisticated image. Right from the start, FHM courted advertisers as hard as they courted readers. EMAP correctly identified that the top brass at IPC were somewhat embarrassed by Loaded's brash tone and had consequently skimped on the title's advertising sales and marketing resources. In addition, FHM forged links with tabloid newspapers like The Sun, providing them with exclusive use of their photo shoots of female celebrities in bikinis in exchange for publicity. Within a very short time, FHM had established an unassailable lead in the British lads publishing market, a lead which neither Loaded nor Maxim, Dennis Publishing's launch in 1995, has ever been able to rival. The success of FHM in the UK demonstrates the power of emulation, especially when executed with verve and confidence. I'm told that the British edition of FHM put £12 million on the bottom line in 2004. EMAP deserves it. Of course, that wasn't quite the case in the Maxim versus FHM battles abroad, but that's a story for another day. The lesson is clear. Despite the words of the old rock and roll song, the original is not the greatest. Not always. If you want to be rich, then watch your rivals closely and never be ashamed to emulate a winning strategy. They may josh you a little for doing it, but that's a price well worth paying. The problem with the great idea is that it concentrates the mind on the idea itself. This is fine as far as it goes, but unless the idea is executed efficiently and with panache and originality, then it doesn't matter how great the idea is, the enterprise will fail. Ideas are certainly of immense importance, but I have seen so many people attempting to create a start-up company become obsessed with proving that their idea is right, rather than obsessed with making money, and I've watched them wasting years doing it. Nobody really cares if an idea is right, except the person who came up with it. Apple, on whose computer these words have been typed, is a case in point. Begun by two nerds in a garage, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, Apple took off with its Apple II computer more than a quarter of a century ago, and, after a difficult period with the ill-fated Lisa model, hit pay dirt with the Macintosh computer in the mid-1980s. More recently, its iPod music storage device has transformed the consumer technology landscape. Let me make it clear that I am a loyal customer and great fan of Apple. I bought a Lisa back in 1983 or thereabouts. I bought the first Mac the next year and have proceeded to buy nearly every new model since. For 20 years, my company has also published the world's finest Macintosh computer magazine, Mac User. I know the company and their products well, at least from a historical perspective. But Apple have a problem. They've always had a problem. His name is Steve Jobs. Steve has been a victim of the fallacy of the great idea over and over again. Back in 1984, Apple were poised to take over the world of personal computing. All their larger rivals, including IBM, were in disarray. They just didn't get the personal computer revolution. Jobs and Wozniak did get it. Apple's products were innovative, slick, cool, and far, far superior in every way to any other personal computer available at that time. In fact, they were so cool, their users often spent a great deal of time proselytizing for the Apple cause. Users like me, for instance. So why is Apple such a small part of the personal computer market today? The answer is Steve Jobs. Steve comes up with or encourages brilliant ideas. He has the guts to back them and to see them through. He is smart, passionate, and a great man. But he will not admit he is wrong, and he would apparently rather go broke than make such an admission. It was Steve, I'm told, who insisted that the early Macintosh computers should be closed boxes, and that the Mac operating system would never be shared or licensed to other manufacturers. A description used by Apple marketeers at the time was that the Mac was like a Cuisinart, a food blender, and did not need to connect to the rest of the world. A Mac could do for you whatever you wanted to do with the computer. It would not compromise itself by sharing the opportunity to communicate with lesser machines or devices. The hardware would be Apple, the accessories would be Apple, the software would be Apple. Open architecture, no compromise with the jerks running the big old-style computing companies who are flexing their muscles and salivating at this burgeoning new market. Steve Jobs would not share his operating system, as IBM and others subsequently did. His attitude towards all rivals, and I've witnessed this at first hand, was astonishingly arrogant. I'll bet it still is. There is a story from the early days of Apple, which I like to believe is true, of Jobs being invited to the CEO's office of a huge rival computer corporation. Steve parked his backside on the corner of the great man's massive desk, leaned over and told him, "I'm going to bury you. Apple is going to bury your company." No, he didn't. They buried him. This arrogance and belief that only his or his company's ideas are right is the dark side of the fire that has driven Apple up and down a financial roller coaster for nearly 30 years. Jobs is the saviour of the company. Jobs is also a man who appears to be in thrall to what he sees in a mirror. It is not true that there is a large sign on Steve Jobs' desk at Apple which reads, "My way or the highway," but the fact that so many people believe there is such a sign tells its own story. Apple's innovations and ideas, as well as its corporate arrogance, are a legend in the computer industry. Those ideas and their eventual execution are often world beaters. But an idea is not enough. It is never enough. And even its successful execution as a piece of technology is not enough if the company refuses to join with the rest of the world and its own customers in cooperative exploitation. Even Apple's iPod, a stunning technological and marketing achievement, is designed to keep the rest of the world at bay. To get songs downloaded onto an iPod, you have to go to the Apple Music Store on the internet. No other source of music officially connects with an iPod. Why? Because it is my way or the highway. It's classic Steve Jobs. Just as he did 2 decades ago, I predict that Steve Jobs will take his company to the top of the share price mountain and then race downhill with them under an avalanche of lesser rivals and mortals who will conspire to connect with each other and thieve Apple's customers. If it wasn't so tragic, it would be hilarious. The story of Apple is a morality tale, a tale of the great idea wrapped in the passion of one man, once Steve Wozniak had departed, wrapped in a ball of arrogance, wrapped up again in a shell of marketing genius. It's great theatre. It makes for wonderful stories in financial newspapers and technology websites. It is a joy to behold for those who know the historical context. But it is not smart business, except in the short term before lesser men have caught up, and except for Steve Jobs. Without Jobs, Apple could never have risen from obscurity to become a world-class brand. But with Steve Jobs, Apple will always attempt to mould the universe to fit Steve's vision of Apple, and will pay the price again and again and again. Lesser companies and men will filch their ideas, connect, and beat Apple at its own game. Steve Jobs is not a monster. He's an all-American maverick and a world-class marketing genius. But until a man or woman as powerful as he is arrives at Apple, over his dead body, who is determined to break the cycle he has indulged in for so many years, Apple will remain merely an icon of awe. It will not become a company of the size that truly could and should bury monsters like IBM. So if I believe all this, why do I use Apple computers? I use them because they're better computers. Far better than any other personal computer available on the planet. And because I was in at the beginning and still feel in myself the incredible excitement that Wozniak and Jobs stirred in what they called the rest of us. I'm still one of the rest of us and will remain loyal to Apple products. In my heart of hearts, too, I wish Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak had buried their corporate rivals. But then, I always was a sucker for the underdog. As for Mr. Jobs himself, you should understand that the character flaws I have harped on about in the preceding paragraphs, if flaws they are, have made him an insanely rich man, far, far richer than I could ever hope to be. His Pixar film animation company has been extraordinarily successful and has now been purchased for nearly $7 billion, yes, $7 billion by Disney. Steve is the majority shareholder in Pixar. He has now become the biggest stockholder in Walt Disney's old media monster. Not bad for a guy with character flaws who started in a garage, eh? Let us hope he helps revive the fortunes of that venerable old beast. Even so, beware of the great idea. You must encourage great ideas and search for them diligently, but either you control and develop such ideas, or the ideas will come to dominate your waking thoughts. And that would not be such a great thing, not unless you are Steve Jobs. I just took a break, and I went down to the local bar to watch the sunset and sink a few beers. There I was foolish enough to mention this chapter, the fallacy of the great idea. A wise gentleman on the bar stool next to me, who has stewardship of more money than I will ever think about, reminded me of the phrase attributed to the American philosopher and poet Ralph Waldo Emerson. If a man write a better book, preach a better sermon, or make a better mousetrap than his neighbour, though he build his house in the woods, the world will make a beaten path to his door. "There's the power of a great idea, Felix," he smiled. "Not so," I countered. "The operative verb is make. It is not think up or dream up, it is make. The idea would be worthless. No one would beat a path to any door unless they heard that the mousetrap had been made." I read that Google, the tremendously successful internet search engine in America, encourages certain staff to spend 20% of their working time developing their own pet ideas. It'll be interesting to see how this plays out. Google raised so much money upon its flotation on the stock market that many Google employees became millionaires overnight. Will such millionaires with a PhD in computer engineering be content to make Google even more money? Or will they strike out on their own? Will there be lawsuits relating to exactly where a particularly successful idea was developed? It'll be fascinating to see. If you never have a single great idea in your life, but become skilled in executing the great ideas of others, you can succeed beyond your wildest dreams. Seek them out and make them work. They do not have to be your ideas. Execution is all in this regard. If, on the other hand, you spend your days thinking up and developing in your mind this great idea or that, you are unlikely to get rich, although you are likely to make many others rich. That is usually the way of it. Ideas don't make you rich. The correct execution of ideas does.